and a wide range of opposition groups, there are reservations about how the truce will hold. In the city of Aleppo, the government has besieged the eastern rebel side for several years. Our Middle East editor Jeremy Bowen has recently arrived in the western part of the city. He sends this report.
The further you drive north in Syria, the more intense the war becomes. This road is the regime's fragile link between Damascus and Aleppo. Rebels cut it this summer where it reaches the Aleppo suburbs. They were only driven back by Syrian troops at the weekend. Shelling was still going on as we drove in, government artillery hitting rebel positions. It's been a long, hot and dangerous summer in Aleppo, and you can see it in the fabric of the city, the damage that's been done. Ceasefire is meant to stop all of that. Since the fighting started here in 2012, the west side of the city has been in government hands. Armed opposition groups control the east. 4 years of fighting have devastated Aleppo. This gives an idea of the firepower of the Syrian army and its Russian backers who've been making gains around Aleppo. One of the big questions about the ceasefire is whether they're prepared to give their enemies a chance to rest and regroup. On the rebel side, there are also doubts. Groups backed by the Americans have been told they have to separate from more radical militias, who they regard as allies. And another important rebel group, Aqra al-Sham, which is backed by Saudi Arabia, has already rejected the ceasefire agreement.
The deal that was announced between the US and Russia to resolve the issue in Syria does not achieve, in our view, the basic minimum goals set by our avenging people. They will lose all their sacrifices and gains.
In Damascus, President Bashar al-Assad chose to celebrate the Muslim festival of Eid al-Adha by visiting and praying in the suburb of Daraya. It was in rebel hands for 5 years until they surrendered at the end of August after what the UN called an unrelenting siege. President Assad's government has backed the ceasefire, but his words suggested that he has unfinished military business.
The Syrian state is determined to recover all areas from the terrorists, to restore security, to rebuild the infrastructure and everything else that was destroyed in both human and material aspects. We came here today to replace the fake freedom that they tried to promote at the beginning of the crisis, like in Daraya, with the real freedom.
People are used to war here. The holiday is being celebrated even though there was a steady thunder of artillery fire throughout the day. The ceasefire agreement is complicated, potentially fragile, and all sides in the war doubt whether it can work. But it's all the diplomats have. At the very least, it might be a respite for the people who need one most. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Aleppo.
Well, with me is Edgar Jalad, the editor of BBC Arabic TV. Edgar, first of all, do we know how it's going?
Well, it's too soon to assess this ceasefire, even that the first reports coming from there are saying that the situation is quieter than before. And at the same time, you can see on social media snaps coming in saying, talking about violations. And we expect to hear that all the time, especially that not all groups are all okay with this ceasefire, and they accepted it, as we've seen in Jeremy's package. But this ceasefire is the most serious agreement that happened so far in the Syrian war. And it's brokered by the two superpowers, and they have their own plans and reasons why it should happen now. And this was imposed on all parties. And if we look at how it was communicated to them, they were not part of it. They don't know much about it. And I wish, as journalists, so we need to know more about this agreement that is divided into 5 chapters with a lot of details, technical details, from the military aspects and other aspects that we don't know yet. The only thing that was communicated to the parties was what is required from them on the ground. Said, you don't have to do this and that, and that's it. That's why it's still ambiguous a little bit for us. But we can see that the power behind it. But on the ground, it's not the end of the war. We all know that. It's the political process, and we are waiting for that.
So in terms of reasons to be optimistic, the fact that this has been brokered by the US and Russia,
Yes.
a very good point in its favour.
Yes.
But there are also reasons for pessimism, some scepticism about whether
Definitely.
this will hold.
The situation on the ground is very complicated. And now the Americans and the Russians, they will cooperate together in a week time from now to attack the Islamic State and the Fatah al-Sham groups that are affiliated with Al-Qaeda. So we don't know where they are. They tried to put some maps to define their areas, but they might infiltrate some other areas. We will see a lot of complications on the ground and accusations, mutual accusations of, and they have both interest in that to show that the other party is not respecting the truth. But at the same time, there is a ceiling, and it's clear to everyone that you can't go beyond this point till further notice. When this is happening, we don't know.
Edgar, thank you very much. Edgar Jalad from BBC Arabic.
Thank you.
Well, another front in the Syrian war is seeing Turkish forces in the northeastern part of the country pitted against Kurdish groups as well as militants from the so-called Islamic State. The town of Jarabulus has been under the control of IS for the last 3 years, and recently people there were finally able to return after Turkish forces drove them out. Mark Lowen sends this report.
For 3 years, this town, Jarabulus, was under the control of so-called Islamic State. But 3 weeks ago, rebel soldiers from the Free Syrian Army, backed by Turkish troops, came in here and retook Jarabulus in a lightning offensive, meeting what seemed to be very limited resistance. You can see there on those walls some of the vestiges of IS control, their logos and their flags. And if you come over here, you get a sense of just how brutal the group was here in Jarabulus, because on this main roundabout, just in front of their banner here, are these 3 metal stands, and this is where Islamic State used to execute those who defied it, those who were accused of crimes, maybe who smoked or who cut their beards too short or wore their trousers too short. This is where punishment was meted out. And in the space of a very short time, IS has been driven out of this town, but also Kurdish fighters have been stopped from taking it. And that is very important for Turkey because it sees Kurdish fighters as a threat. So it has now created, in a sense, a kind of de facto safe zone here in Jarabulus without IS and without the Kurdish fighters. And Turkey now feels emboldened by this operation to push on into other IS strongholds as it moves further south to, in its words, cleanse Syria from Islamic State. The Turkish president says that is the duty of Turkey, to free Syria from the militant group.
Mark Lowen reporting from Jarabulus. Donald Trump says health is now an issue in the race for the White House after it emerged that Hillary Clinton is being treated for pneumonia. Mrs. Clinton has pulled out of a campaign trip to California after appearing to collapse as she left a 9/11 memorial on Sunday. Mr. Trump, her Republican rival who's catching up in the polls, says he's going to release his own medical report. From Washington, our North America editor, John Sopel.
Good morning, America. It's 8 a.m. Hillary Clinton's health.
There's only one subject of conversation today in the US, and it's Hillary Clinton's health after apparently collapsing yesterday in New York. How serious is her condition? What impact will it have on the race? Why wasn't her team more open about the diagnosis? But she has at least received one verbal get well soon card.
Hope she gets well soon. I don't know what's going on. I'm like you. I see what I see. The coughing fit was a week ago, so I assume that was pneumonia also.
I've been talking so...
The coughing fit came in Cleveland last week, though she did her best to make a joke of it.
Every time I think about Trump, I get allergic.
And yesterday too, after her collapse, she tried to make light of it all. But it would be hours before her team would admit that she had pneumonia, even though the diagnosis had come days earlier. And on social media, even friends have been critical. This is David Axelrod, who was Barack Obama's campaign manager in 2008. Antibiotics can take care of pneumonia. What's the cure for an unhealthy penchant for privacy that repeatedly creates unnecessary problems?
And so a new twist in the race for the White House. Health is now a major issue. And though it may sound trivial to talk about the lack of openness with which her illness was communicated, it feeds into a narrative. Whether it be about her email server, money raised by the Clinton Foundation, there's a sense there is a lack of transparency. And Hillary Clinton can't afford to give voters new reasons to doubt her. John Sopel, BBC News, Washington.
Well, Ken Vogel is a veteran follower of US politics for the website Politico and joins me from its Washington offices. Ken Vogel, welcome to you again. It's dominating all the airwaves, as you know very well. I mean, how significant do you think this issue is of health for the campaign overall?
Well, unless the Clinton campaign voluntarily releases some bombshell about Hillary Clinton's health, which, given the recent track record, seems unlikely, because they have only grudgingly released information, and even then, only when there's been video evidence or something sort of forcing their hand. So, barring that, barring a major disclosure, I don't see it as being particularly significant. These are both senior citizens running for the highest office in the land, and the voters are pretty well polarized. They're pretty well locked in. The folks who are not, the very narrow slice of swing voters in the middle, I don't see health as being a major issue in their sort of deciding factor.
But if the Trump campaign want to make an even bigger issue of it, what's to stop them?
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, Donald Trump and his surrogates had been really hammering Hillary Clinton on health-related issues, raising questions in kind of a murky way with a lot of innuendo. Now that they actually have some evidence that things are potentially more serious, they've kind of dialed it back, and they've taken this approach, as you saw from Donald Trump in the piece, about wishing her well and not really commenting on it. That's probably the smart political approach, because now you have the attention of the nation's political news media focused like a laser on getting more information about Hillary Clinton's health. That will kind of keep it a story even without Donald Trump saying anything.
Right, you mentioned two words there, more information. Isn't that also what's behind this, the lack of information, or the perceived lack of information from the Clinton campaign, even coming from someone like Donald Trump, who hasn't said a great deal about his own affairs?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it is more than a perceived lack of information. This is very much the Clintons' approach to everything. That is a disclosure only when it is required of them, or when there is such a drumbeat of criticism and scrutiny towards whatever the subject matter is. Donald Trump, you're right, he also has not been particularly revelatory in a voluntary way, but he is much more open in his conversations with the press. He does a lot more press. He's out in front of voters a lot more than Hillary Clinton, whose team has kept her much more guarded and sort of secluded. So that all plays into this really mounting scrutiny of Hillary Clinton and her health right now.
Is there any way this could potentially endear the public to Hillary Clinton, this chink in her armour, this scene of her as a mere human being who does have these moments of weakness, and perhaps a little bit of sympathy might be coming out for her?
Yeah, certainly that's possible. That is if, this is something that turns out to be just pneumonia and she's able to overcome it and appear back on the campaign trail with a lot of vim and vigor. She has a history of having a ton of stamina. I traveled with her campaign in 2008. I got sick because the schedule was so brutal and so grueling, and she did not get sick. So if she returns to form, now granted that was 8 years ago, so she's 8 years older now, but if she returns to the form even that she showed early on in the race, it is possible that people will see, oh, look, she's vulnerable, she gets sick from a tough schedule. If not, and if there are these lingering questions that remain, it could potentially be something that Donald Trump might use, or his supporters might use, to great political effect.
Ken Vogel, thank you very much for your time joining us there from Politico in Washington. Now, the Hollywood actor and campaigner George Clooney has released the findings of a report into the civil war in South Sudan, and its headline claimed that both sides of the conflict have been getting richer, while the rest of the country's been getting dramatically poorer. Clooney is a long-time campaigner for human rights in South Sudan, and it's his investigative unit, The Sentry, that spent 2 years looking into these allegations of war profiteering. Alistair Leithhead reports.
Civil war has torn the world's youngest country apart. For nearly 3 years, a fallout between two of South Sudan's most powerful men, former Vice President Riek Machar and President Salva Kiir, led to ethnic-based violence and terrible atrocities committed by both sides. 2.5 million people have been forced from their homes. Millions more still need food aid. Now, an investigative unit backed by George Clooney has linked the men to the money.
The simple fact is, They're stealing the money to fund their militias to attack and kill one another. The evidence is thorough, it is detailed, and it is irrefutable.
The report alleges dodgy business deals and nepotism. President Salva Kiir's wife and at least 7 of his children are linked to a whole range of businesses. It says his 12-year-old son had a 25% share in a holding company. And it claims his brother-in-law's company supplied fuel to the military while he was a senior officer.
It appears that Riek Machar has been involved in similar types of engagements. He had been engaged in negotiations to sell the country's oil production for defense products, for weapons, in order to fuel his rebellion. We also found evidence that a member of his family, a nephew of his, was involved in a violent and hostile takeover of a security company operating in South Sudan, in which several members of that security company were held hostage and forced to sign checks.
The report says that top politicians and generals in South Sudan, despite their low salaries, have luxury villas in Uganda, Ethiopia and Australia, and that here in Nairobi, both Salva Kiir and Riek Machar have homes in the same upscale neighbourhood.
Diplomacy in this particular instance.
George Clooney and John Prendergast, a human rights activist, have taken a practical interest in Sudan and South Sudan for many years. The report says the Century endeavoured to contact every individual and entity, and in most cases they did not respond. But they said action could be taken.
This approach would utilize these precision-guided financial policy tools, normally reserved for countering terrorism, for fighting organized crime, for halting the proliferation of nuclear weapons. But this time, we want to use these tools, these policy tools, in the service of human rights and peace and good governance in South Sudan.
A larger peacekeeping force is due to help bring a peace deal back on track, but there's little confidence the crisis affecting so many millions of people will be resolved anytime soon. Alistair Leithhead, BBC News, Nairobi.
A look at some of the day's other news stories. Facebook has failed to stop legal action by a 14-year-old girl in Northern Ireland who's suing it because a naked photo of her was posted on the social media site. The girl is seeking damages in what's believed to be the first case of its kind. Authorities in Florida are investigating a possible arson attack on the mosque attended by Omar Mateen, the gunman accused of the Orlando nightclub shooting in June. The local sheriff's office said surveillance video showed someone approaching the Islamic Centre of Fort Pierce moments before a fire broke out in the early hours of Monday. Austria's interior minister says a planned rerun of the presidential election will now take place in December. It's been postponed from next month after some postal voters complained that the glue on their forms wasn't working properly, making the votes invalid. The former British Prime Minister David Cameron has resigned his seat in the House of Commons. Mr Cameron left Downing Street in July after losing the referendum on Britain's membership of the European Union. He says he fully supports the new Prime Minister, Theresa May, and doesn't want to be a distraction from the work of her government. Our political editor, Laura Kunsberg, reports.
Not just out of number 10, but out of politics too. Despite the promise he would go on, David Cameron is walking away from Westminster. Friends say he doesn't want to be a backseat driver and make life harder for Theresa May.
With modern politics, with the circumstances of my resignation, it isn't really possible to be a proper backbench MP as a former Prime Minister. I think everything you do will become a big distraction and a big diversion from what the government needs to do for our country.
No Tory leader had ever posed with huskies before, but no Tory leader had put such a premium on changing their party before. And it took them back to power, albeit through the early coalition love-in, before winning outright just last year.
I think he's provided outstanding leadership for this country. I think he often made the job look very easy when actually it was incredibly difficult, and I think he leaves behind a very strong legacy for the Conservative Party.
But the headline of David Cameron's chapter in history will be promising and then losing his referendum gamble.
The British people have spoken and the answer is we're out.
Transforming the UK's place in the world, turning politics upside down.
And now he's done what he said he wouldn't do and walked away, leaving a huge mess to be cleared up. So I don't think today is a day for tributes to his record. I think he'll be remembered as a very bad Prime Minister.
Friends deny he's flounced out because he doesn't agree with the new boss. But there's a real danger, they admit. Anything he said could drive a wedge. And David Cameron himself accepts they differ.
Obviously, I'm going to have my own views about different issues. People would know that. And that's really the point. As a former Prime Minister, it is very difficult, I think, to sit as a backbencher and not be an enormous diversion and distraction from what the government's doing.
He was sometimes accused of believing his own hype.
Nothing is really impossible if you put your mind to it. After all, as I once said, I was the future once.
Such recent history feels already so much in the past. Laura Kunzberg, BBC News, Westminster.
It's been another successful day for Britain's Paralympians in Rio. Will Bailey overcame disappointment in 2012 at a hostile crowd rooting for his Brazilian opponent to win gold in the table tennis, while Aled Davis set a record in his shot put category. Our sports correspondent Andy Swiss reports.
If you've ever wondered what being Paralympic champion means, well, here's the answer. Will Bailey was born with a condition which restricts the movement of his limbs. But when he was 7, his grandmother bought him a table tennis table, and this is where it's led him. He was up against Brazil's Israel Stroh and most of the crowd. But after silver in London, it was gold. And what a celebration. Bailey's clambering onto the table earned him a yellow card. But he didn't seem to mind. A hug for the umpire, followed by something even more exuberant. A tearful Bailey later said he'd achieved the impossible. Meanwhile, a sweltering day proved the sweetest for Aled Davis, one of the stars of London 2012 with a new Paralympic record in the shot put and another gold to add to Britain's ever-expanding collection. On Sunday, they won 8, their best day so far, finished off by the flashing blades of Richard Whitehead as he charged to the 200 metres. And behind him, former Army captain Dave Henson, just 5 years after losing his legs in an explosion in Afghanistan, a barely believable bronze. Another of yesterday's champions told me in this British team, success is inspiring success.
I remember on Friday night, coming back from my event, and then there's a slow motion of Johnny Peacock coming through the line and stuff, and he's won, and you saw Richard Whitehead and a few others that kind of added to this thing, and these swimmers are doing it as well, and it's it just leads to more and more and more, and it's you just want to be part of the club.
There was one rare disappointment though. Just a day after becoming a dad to baby Lenny, David Weir could only finish 5th in his 400 metres. But America's Tatiana McFadden fared rather better in hers. She's chasing an extraordinary feat, a medal at every distance from the 100 metres to the marathon. And so far, she's on track for history.
Andy Swiss reporting there. While we've been on air, the US Secretary of State John Kerry's called on all sides to keep to the ceasefire in Syria. He said it's too early to tell whether the truce is holding, but latest reports say the worst conflict areas are quiet.
The earliest reports are that there's some reduction in violence, as well as a few reports of fighting here and there, though it is far too early to draw any definitive conclusions, and I am not drawing any definitive conclusions. Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said that major conflict zones in Syria were calm after the ceasefire took effect at 7 p.m. on Monday. Their quote is, "Calm is prevailing." The director said, giving an early assessment. I repeat, early assessment.
That's John Kerry speaking in the last few minutes at the State Department, US Secretary of State, after a couple of hours of that new truce in Syria. There'll be more on the BBC News app and on our website. If you want to get in touch with us at BBC World News, we're on social media. I'm at Karin BBC on Twitter. We also have a Facebook page. That's it from the programme. The weather's coming next. Goodbye.